Hello everyone and welcome to today's class. This project is called Staycation, and that means that we are literally going to use this painting to create a vacation that we take at home. So a staycation means that you're on vacation but you are staying at home. So we're going to paint an image of kind of where we would rather be. And for me, I would rather be at the beach or near some water. So that's why you have this image here in front of you. Okay. So I'm going to work through the steps of how to paint this image using what we've learned in the previous classes. So I am going to jump right in and move the example out of the way. All right, to get started, you're going to need your pencil. Later on, you'll need your permanent marker. You'll need your brush, your paints, water cup, paper towel, paper. All right, to get started, I'm going to start with my wave design. You can do your wave design with 3 to 4 lines. Remember, the wave lines are basically like different types of curved lines that run from one end of the page to the other. So from one end of the page to the other. You can decide what types of curved lines that you do. That's completely up to you. So I am going to start at the bottom of my page and I'm going to start drawing my wave design. Completely up to you how yours looks. Then after that, we're going to do what would be more or less like a landmass. So almost like a mountain or just some area that would be like grass or sand or something like that. So I am going to create just one hump. So one mountain in a sense on this one. In my first one, I did 2. So it's up to you, however many you want to do. In the background of our design, so up in this area, we are going to put a sun, and we're going to make the sun fairly large, and we'll include the round part of the sun, and then we'll draw sun rays that radiate out from that round part. So I am going to place my sun over here. So essentially it's a half circle. So one big curve from one part of your mountaintop to another. And then from there, I am going to turn my paper some so I can start drawing my sun rays. And these are just going to be angled lines that all come out from the edge of the circle part of the sun. So I am going to just start to draw lines. You can make your lines curved or straight. It's completely up to you. Put some space between them though. You don't want to make the spaces in between too skinny, and it'll make it a little bit harder to paint. So try to put some space between your lines. Okay, I don't love that line over there. So I think I'm going to change the direction of that line with my eraser. You can, of course, make changes if you need to. Because this line goes straight on this side, I really kind of feel like it should also do the same on this side. So I'm going to kind of make more of a straight line over here. So you can look at your drawing and make adjustments to it as needed. So there's my finished drawing. The next step is to start painting. You need to remember that once you start the painting process, you don't want to paint 2 sections that are right next to each other, because 2 wet sections of paint will likely run and bleed into each other, so the paint will start to mix together in the 2 sections. So we want to make sure that we paint a section, skip, paint, skip what's next, paint. So we want to keep space in between the areas that we paint so that the paint does not run from one section to the next. So I am going to start down here at the bottom. Since this is my water, 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 land, sun. So we're going to start the painting process at the bottom. I do like to wet the paper first, just because it is water, and I want the water to look sort of like it's moving around on the paper and not so much like it's flat paint. So I like to add water first because that gives the paint an opportunity to just sort of shift around on its own, because the wet paper will start to move the paint around. So I'm going to start with my blue paint. I'm going to put a little bit of water into my paint. Get some water on my brush. And I'm just going to start to drop some water onto the painting in the area that I wet first. And then I'm just going to use my brush to kind of shift that paint around. Make sure that area gets covered. Along the line, I do want to drag my brush the same as before, so we can create a nice clean line. Drag my brush along the line. And when you get close to these like really tight corners and spaces, remember you can turn the paper if you need to. And then I'm going to switch and use more or less the tip of my brush to paint in these tighter spots. So I just want to move that water around, move that paint around, all the way to the edge. Now, I want this first section to be mainly blue. So I'm going to let this section stay blue. But right now, you can see like it's a little darker in some areas and lighter in some areas. And I actually want that to happen. So I'm going to do that a little bit more by just adding some more blue in some different places on the page, just to create some changes in the value of the color of the water. I want there to be some light areas and some dark areas. If you remember from the last class, value is the lightness or darkness of a color. So I want some places to be lighter and some places to be darker. And I'm just being pretty random about where that happens right now. Okay, so there's my first section that I painted. Now, because I painted this section first, I don't want to paint this section of the water because it's right next to this section. And if the wet paint here touches the wet paint here, they'll mix together, and I don't want that to happen. So the next section that I'll paint will be this section here. Now, if you remember from the last class, and you can always check the demo videos on YouTube to see what we talked about in the last class, we talked about how changes in value can help establish space. So the term that we're learning this class is space. So space is just what's around you, and objects are separated in space. So if I am standing here on the beach here and I am looking out at the water occupies the space between myself and this landmass on the other side. And same thing with the sun. So everything between myself and another thing that I see occupies the space in between. Anytime that you create a painting or a drawing, you typically are doing it on a flat sheet of paper. It's obviously flat, so you can't really say that there's any space between it. But when you look at a flat sheet of paper and you want to make it look like there's space there, you want to make it look like this part of the water is in the front and this sun is all the way in the back. You do that by changing your value. So you do that by adding lights and darks in the work. Okay? So because this part of the water is closest to me, I want that to really be the lightest. And because this part of the water is the farthest away, I want this to be the darkest. So I want to go from light and just gradually get darker as I do each section of water. So the first thing I want to do to actually lighten up part of the blue water that I painted is I am going to use my paper towel the same way we've done in other classes. I have like a little piece of paper towel that I tore off, and I am going to just press into my blue paint and just start to lift some of it up. So I want this to be light, medium, dark in terms of how I paint. So I'm going to skip this section. I know I'm going to make this kind of a turquoise color. In this section, I want to mix the blue and the purple. So I'm going to wet my paper first, the same as I did before. Right along the lines, we're going to drag my brush, kind of keep the paint in the line. Remember, wetting the paper first just helps the paint move around. And because we are painting water, I do want it to have that sort of like watery, fluid look versus just being like a flat, solid color of paint. I use the tip of the brush in small spaces. All right, so now I'm going to start the same way I did before. I'm just going to start adding some blue paint into my water. Just let the water move the paint around. And I'm going to start to move the paint around myself with the brush. Turn the paper as needed. If you can't turn your arm in an awkward way to paint a particular section, then just turn the paper. And I'm just going to keep moving this blue paint around. Drag the brush along the edge. Keep a clean line. Okay. Now right now, this section is basically the same color as this section down here. And that's not necessarily what I want. I want this section to be darker. So what I'm going to do in this section is I am going to start to add a little bit of purple paint in this section. Oops, clean that off. Purple paint in this section also. So I'm taking my water, putting a little bit of purple paint in my water. So I'm taking my water, I'm putting a little bit of water into my purple paint. And then in the same way, I'm just going to start dropping some purple paint into this blue. Now, right now, I want all of this to mix together to create a new color. So I'm just going to start to brush those two colors together so that it will mix. I don't want it to look like the purple is fading into the blue. I want it to look like a new color completely. So I am just brushing all around to mix the blue and the purple together. So just brush to mix. All this color together. It's still a little light to me, just looking at it. Like this value is still very close to this value. So I'm actually going to add a little bit more purple. Because right now I want it to get a little bit darker. And then as we know from our other classes, another way to make it darker is to add a second coat of paint. So we'll do that a little bit later. Because in order to add a second coat of paint, I have to let the first coat of paint dry. All right, so I'm really just kind of mixing it because I don't want it to look completely purple and I don't want it to look completely blue. Just trying to make a new color. All right. And I'm going to let that dry. Again, I don't want to paint this section next, and I don't want to paint this section next because they're right next to two wet sections. So I'm going to skip this section, and I'm going to paint this next. Okay, for the next section, this part is more or less my land mass. So this is where dirt would be, grass would be, trees would be, anything like that. So in this section, just like my example painting, I am going to use more greens in this section. Now, these are the colors that I chose to use for my painting. You can use different colors if you want. That's completely up to you. All right, so I am going to get some water on my brush, drop some paint into the green, drop some water into the green paint, soften up that paint, and the same that I did before. I'm getting some water on my brush, and then I am going to wet this section that I want to paint in. Keep your edges clean by dragging your brush along the line. I'm just adding water to this full section. Turn my paper as needed. Now in this section, I'm going to add green, and then I'm going to lighten up the green some with the color yellow. I probably will add a little bit of brown too. Now in this section, I don't want to mix the green and yellow completely. I do want it to look like it's green at the top mainly, and it starts to turn more yellow as you get closer to the water. So I am going to clean the green out of my brush, drop some water into the yellow, and then I am going to start to add the yellow right beneath the green. And it's okay if they kind of just run into one another, that's perfectly fine. I want to do it without getting too much of the green on my brush because I don't want to mix a lot of green into my yellow paint, but I do want to get the yellow onto the page. All right, so I have a good bit of yellow. I'm going to put my brush in the water, and then I am going to just use the water in the brush to just make sure that right where the green and the yellow meet, the two colors are blending together. I'm not painting all over. I don't want to make a new color here. I want it to be green at the top, and I want it to be yellow sort of in the middle. So I just use the water to blend where the two colors met, but not to mix them together. I'm actually going to add, as we get closer to the beach, of course, you have a little bit more sand. So I'm just going to add a little bit of brown in some sections near the bottom, just to make it look like there's a little bit of sand as you get closer to the water, because this section will be water. Now I have a lot of water in this section already, so you see like there's a water puddle here, there's water puddling over here. So I don't need to have a super wet brush, so I'm actually going to dry my brush out a little bit and just work with the water that's already here. Clean up my edges. Now I know the paint looks fairly light right now, but we will go back and make the paint look darker and brighter and bolder when we go in with our second coat of paint. So I am going to let this dry as is, and then I'll come back and I'll paint the other sections. I'm going to start painting the sun section. Now I do want all of this to be yellow at first. Before I add the other color, I want the entire thing to be yellow. So I'm going to start by just painting everything at the top yellow. So this is a reminder of what look we're going for. So even up under this orange and red, everything is yellow. So I'm going to paint everything yellow first. Pretty easy to do. I'm just going to wet the whole section. Since this is kind of a larger section at the top, just gonna wet all that first. I don't have to be super careful. And then as I get closer to my line between the sun and the mountain or the land, then I'm gonna be a little bit more careful with my brush and really sort of line those edges by dragging the brush. All right, I'm gonna grab some of my yellow paint. As you can see, I did clean my water so that I wouldn't get those dark colors into my light yellow paint. And same as before, I'm just dropping paint into that wet paper, and I'm going to start to move it around. So I want to get enough paint on there to make it pretty easy to move it all around. So I'm just gonna let that sit and dry. But while this yellow section up top is drying, I can actually go ahead and start to add my second coat to the bottom section that I did first and the sort of purple blue section in the middle that I did after that. So I'm just gonna work in these two sections here. And I want to just add a second coat in some places, add just some darker value in some places. So I don't necessarily need to repaint this entire section. So all I'm going to do, I'm not going to wet the whole section. I'm just going to wet sort of right along the edge. And I'm just going to do one part of it at a time. I'm going to go ahead and get some more blue paint. This would officially be my second coat of paint in this section. So of course it's going to make it get a little darker. And that's what we've been talking about over the last few classes. I like changes in value, how to get your paint darker. It's really just a matter of letting the paint dry. So I'm just sort of adding some wet paint along the edge and then adding a little bit of blue. I had already added water along this edge. So I'm just going to continue to add some paint. And you can pick and choose like different parts to add more water to. So maybe I want my water to sort of get a little darker in this section as well. So you decide. I would definitely put it along the edge where the pencil line is. But you can decide what parts of it kind of flows out into the rest of the water. There. All right. So I'm going to add a little water to my brush. And right where the dark color meets the light color, I'm just going to add some water. And that will start to just erase out that hard edge that I created before. And it will help it sort of just gradually fade out into the water around it. All right, so you can see in this section how I went darker in some places and left it lighter in other places. I'm going to do the same thing in this section here. I'm going to do it sort of along the bottom edge. Now you can let your paint dry a little longer than I let my paint dry because I have to move pretty fast just for the class. But you don't necessarily have to do that. You can let yours dry completely before adding a second coat. In this section, I have a little bit more blue and purple in this section, so I'm going to start with a little blue. Just adding a little blue right along that edge to make it darker. Right where I added that water. Again, I'm still dabbing the paint. I'm not really like painting a long brush stroke. Just sort of dabbing the paint right along that edge. Trying to sort of keep that clean line. Try to work down your pencil lines. All right, I'm gonna add a little bit to a couple places in the top of this section. Not a lot though, not the whole thing. Add a little bit more blue. Just right where in the places where I just added that water. Then I'm actually going to grab a little bit of purple. And then in some of these spaces, I am going to dab in a little purple. And I am going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to use the water in my brush to just help that color just spread out so it's not like one hard line between the lights and the darks. I do see this places where it's starting to kind of run down into that green section. It's not making too much of a color change right now, so I'm just going to let it be. Because I know once I go back to that green section, I'm going to darken up those edges anyway. So I can clean that up when I do that. So just kind of move that paint around. And I'm just dabbing. Just like dot, 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 dot. With my brush. Just to make it darker in some areas. You can see that the paper is really wet, so it starts to curl up a lot. Now at this point, this section is wet, this section is wet, and this section is wet. So I need to let all of this dry before I move forward. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to let this sit and dry. Now I'm going to add some color up here in my sun area. My water's not too dirty, so I'm going to go ahead and stick with this cup of water for now. Now I do want to add a bit of wet yellow paint here. Even though the yellow's there and it's already dry, it'll help when it comes to color mixing to add some more wet yellow paint. But this time I'm going to do the same thing I was doing before. I'm going to stick pretty close to the edge here. So right near the line. So when I say edge, I'm really speaking about sticking pretty close to the lines when it comes to your color mixing. We are going to paint the last section of the painting, and that's going to be the landmass or mountain, just where the land is versus the water. To start by just adding some water to the page. What you see happening in this painting that I'm working on now and the painting that I used as the example are two slightly different painting processes, and I'll show you the difference towards the end. But for right now, I'm going to continue with this painting. I want the colors of the landmass to be a bit brighter, so I'm adding a second coat of paint. I also want to make sure that I keep that change in values. I also want it to be a bit more green. Right now there's a lot of yellow, so I'm going to pull that green paint down a little farther into the painting. But I am going to add more yellow just because I want to lighten up the green, and when I mix the yellow and the green together, I get a bit more of like a yellow green color. But I am going to push this more to I want it to be more green and brown than green and yellow. So the yellow is really just going to be in an effort to lighten up the green into more of a lime green color. So I'm just using it to mix right now. So I am going to sort of brush these two together, just so I can have an area where I'm lightening up the green with the yellow. So I can have a slightly lime yellowish green color. So it's always up to you. You determine what color you want something to be. Now here in this section I have another puddle, but because this is a landmass, and I'd like for it to look like maybe there's some highs and lows in that landmass, instead of getting rid of the puddle like I did in the top, I'm going to keep this puddle here and let that dry just like this, because I want to keep that darker area. Alright, I'm going to add a little bit of water down near the bottom where I want to add the brown paint. I'm going to put a little water in my brown. And start to add the brown near the bottom of my land section. I'm just going to let that color run right up. I'm going to let this do what it's doing. I'm not going to mess with it too much. Just kind of see what happens with it. It's the cool thing about watercolors. You just sort of get a lot of surprise effects sometimes. Alright, I'm going to add a little water to the places where the brown and the green color mix, or where they meet, I should say. And then I'm going to add a little bit more brown in some sections where I want it to kind of go a little darker. So just a little tap here and there. That helps me really push the color around. Blend that out a little bit. Alright, that's really it for that section. I'm not going to do much more to it. Now I'm going to let all of this dry, and then once it's all dry, I am going to put my black outlines on it. I'm going to show you the differences in the two paintings, and it's all in your approach in terms of how you paint. The biggest difference is you see these sort of like hard edges here, these really where the paint did not mix. This paint here did not mix with the painting up under it. So same thing down here, like this paint, you see these sort of like hard edges of the paint didn't mix with the paint down here, and you have less of that in this one. See, it's a lot smoother in terms of the color transitions. The only difference between these two, and this is a matter of learning how to control the watercolor, the only difference between these two is that the bulk of this was painted in what's called wet on wet. So even when I added the darker colors to each section, the paint in the section was still pretty wet, okay? So it helped to blend the colors out from the dark to the light in each section. So every time I painted a section, when I added the darker edges, I did it while the paint was wet. Okay. In this one, I painted a first coat. I let the first coat of paint dry completely, and then I added the darker values in a second coat of paint. So I put wet paint on top of dry paint. So this is called wet on dry. Okay, those are two different watercolor painting processes. Wet on wet, meaning painting wet paint onto wet paint. Wet on dry, meaning painting wet paint onto dry paint. And you can see just in the sort of teal sections, you see the difference. This one creates sort of like a hard edge. This one creates a more fluid color transition. Okay, wet on dry, wet on wet. For the last part of the assignment, we are going to take our permanent marker and we are going to use the permanent marker to clean up the lines of the painting. So we are going to just add marker lines where we have pencil lines. So I'm just going to outline my pencil lines, and that'll just start to clean up the painting and make it look a lot neater. It's easier for me to turn my paper, so I'm going to do that. So everywhere that I have pencil lines, I'm just going to trace with my marker. Instructions are the same as they have been in every class. My hand is planted on the table, meaning my hand is on the table. Okay, that helps me control the marker. My fingers are close to the tip of the marker. Remember, you have more control if you hold it closer to the tip than you do if your hand is farther back. Like it's really loose this way, it's hard to control your mark. But if you move your hands closer to the tip, plant your hand on the table, it makes it easier to just sort of have a lot of control when you're drawing that line. So go slow, start from the edge of the paper, and just trace your pencil lines all the way across the page.